Hey guys, thanks for watching. First I'm going to ink with a Copic multiliner. I usually go with a thicker line, but this is a pretty tiny drawing, so I'm going to use a 0.2 millimeter. Really tiny. And I'm going to ink everything except for the wings, I think. Let me see. Yeah, everything gets a dark outline except for the wings, which get like purple. Oh, hi John. Thanks for watching. I'll occasionally take a look at the comments. So if you guys have any questions, just let me know in the chat. The plan is to ink this whole thing and then color it with watercolor. You know, I typically ink with a brush, but I'm going for the style of the new show, She-Ra, if you guys are not familiar. And they have kind of like a clear line style, as does most animation. I just realized I already messed up. I was going to do purple line on the wings, so I'll have to fix that later. What I'm going to be using for the colored lines is acrylic wash, which is it's an acrylic paint that dries matte. So I used to use it for all my painting up until about 2008, and now I just use it for things like lettering or colored line inking for originals. As you can see, I have my reference here. Just some stuff I found online. I'm pretty much doing this drawing, basically just copying it with a few changes here and there. This is a gift for someone, so I didn't feel it necessary to do something completely original. Yep, I stand, well, I don't stand all the time, I stand about half the time. When I'm doing live stream, I like standing so I can kind of, I've got free range of motion. Let's see. How are my holidays? They were good. And top tips for painting with watercolor. Let's see. I don't know. I'll talk about it later on once I get into watercolor. I have kind of a few different methods for using it. Since I use both gouache and watercolor, I use gouache for kind of more involved paintings, and then watercolor for anything that is, going to be line, ink plus watercolor, or ink plus color. I gotta double check my reference here. Okay. Once I start painting, I like to make sure I actually have printed reference so I don't have to keep going back to the computer. But every once in a while I forget something. That'll be some key piece of information that I don't have. Even for something, a simple drawing like this, pared down animation style, there's still details that I forget. Especially for some character that I have never drawn before. Sorry if my sorry if my head's getting in the way there. As you can see, I'm just kind of jumping all around. It's like whatever I feel like drawing. There's not really any rhyme or reason to it. And since it's a pen, the lines, as soon as you put them down, they dry pretty quickly. So you don't have to worry too much about smearing or anything like that. And it was a pretty tight drawing, so, there's not a lot left to chance. I know pretty much where all the lines are going to go. Even with a pen like this, you still can get some variation in weight depending on how hard you press, but everything is pretty much the same. Let's see, okay, so the wing will all be purple. And that'll be what I do next after I'm finished with this. If you're not familiar with my setup, I always have a metal board to draw on. And that way everything can stick with magnets. So I've got one magnet holding this in. And a magnet holding my reference, and my pencil, and the paint once I start to use it. Let's see, let's see. I'll leave the wings for purple. I think that's it for ink. Alright, so next I will move to acrylic gouache, which is, like I said, acrylic paint that dries to a matte finish. And I'll answer some questions. Why use watercolor instead of watered down gouache? Because gouache is meant to be opaque, and so I will use acrylic gouache for the lines on the wings, and then I will use watercolor on the main body because I don't want it to cover up any of the line work that I've already done. So that's typically the way I work for these kind of commissions. You know, I ink first and then I do watercolor on top, and the watercolor doesn't cover up any of the black lines. There are some pigments that will cover up black lines, but I tend to use mostly transparent stuff, with a few exceptions here and there that I need to be careful of. I also don't typically add white to anything because that'll give it a little bit of opacity. I mean, there are whites that won't add to opacity, but most of the time I just let the white of the paper show through, and that gives me enough of variation. Alright, so I'm going to use, actually, maybe I'll use a different brush. I'll use a liner of some sort. This is Silver Brush Golden Natural, which is a mixture of synthetic fibers and natural hair. So you kind of get the best of both worlds. And this is better for acrylic paint that's not too watered down. I'm actually not entirely sure I'm going to use this. This color might be too light, but I'm going to try it out first just to see how things go. I'm not even going to put it on a palette. I'm just going to let it sit there on my test strip because I don't need a ton of it. And you may not be able to see it, but I've got water off to the side. I kind of want to see how dark this is before deciding whether or not I want to do the whole thing like this. And I should probably have a paper towel ready just in case. It's nice to keep your clean hands going. Yeah, that's like right on the edge. Maybe too light. Let me see how. Let me do a little bit more, and then I'll decide if I want to go to pure violet. Yeah, I think that's going to be too light because even though the wings are colorful, they're actually pretty dark colors despite being vibrant. So I want to make sure that that line will stand out. So I've got a whole bunch to choose from. Probably go with this violet, and I won't go full strength on it. I'll water it down just a little bit. And maybe I'll even mix the two depending on how things go. Like I could use the lighter violet on the wing that's farthest away from us. And that'll give kind of like a nice haze effect to it without much work. So just two little dollops of paint there. And then I can kind of go between the two and mix them if I need to. You know, for a while there I was putting them on this palette, but I put them in a few spots. Like I think that spot, some acrylic gouache, and now it's stuck there because I didn't clean it off. And you can still peel it off, but it takes a little bit of work. So I'm just going to put it here, that way I can throw it away later. Maybe I'll do this up here so you guys can actually see what I'm doing. Maybe I'll give it a spritz. away from the art, of course. I always keep a little spritzer nearby whenever I'm doing any kind of painting work. Okay. The liner brush is always nice for long, clean lines. Because the brush acts as a shock absorber. Unlike with a pen, where your hand has to do all the work, with a brush, your hand can actually shake a little. It doesn't matter. Now this I do actually have to watch out with my hand so that I don't smear anything. Colored lines are no big deal in computer coloring in Photoshop, but I always like the look on original art because it kind of takes an extra step. I'm trying to do it with one stroke because things usually look better if you can get it done with one stroke, but it's not always possible. What I should do is just use my palette knife and mix those two together, but we're doing so little here that it doesn't matter that much. It wouldn't save us that much time. Kind of messed up there. Not a big deal. I'll just fix that later with a little bit of white acrylic wash. I actually don't like this brush that much. Or rather, the way that I think it's supposed to be used is not the way I typically paint. When I typically do a stroke, I'm actually going kind of at a perpendicular angle to the shaft of the brush, Whereas with a liner, I think what you're supposed to do is go in the same direction. You know, keep the brush and the direction in parallel. So that's why things like that happen. Not using it the right way. I'm going to darken this area a little bit. Fix anything that looks out of place. That all looks pretty good. I'm going to move my magnet over here. You know, I typically keep them on the left side because I'm right-handed, but every once in a while I need to move things around, especially when I need to work on the left side. So on this, we have two things we need to do. We need to cover up that black line. That was the very first mistake that I made. So we're going to go a little bit lighter. The second thing is we got to go lighter than the other wing to kind of push it back in space. Let's do the top of the wing first. Give this one more spritz. So that's an ear, so that doesn't need to be purple. All right, sorry, I got to get in a little bit close. So pardon my big head. I'm going to let that dry, and then I'm going to come back and hit it again. Because I want to keep things pretty thin, but I also want to cover up that black line. Get my reference out of the way for a second. Almost done. Once we're done with the wing, then we can start watercoloring. And before we start watercoloring, I'll take a little break and answer some questions if you have any. Now, we'll go back and hit that first line again. Lighten it up just a tad. was a mistake there. Except for the fact that it's recorded on video for all of posterity. All right, so it looks like it is all inked. I'm going to let that dry just a tad, and then I will go back and give it a pretty good erasing with my kneaded eraser. And while it's doing that, I'll answer some questions. I'm going to get all the acrylic paint off of my brush. I usually don't wash this one, but I also make sure that no acrylic paint gets up into the ferrule, up in there. All right, let's see, some questions. What's the story behind this piece? It's a gift for a little girl in Florida that I meant to get done in time for Christmas, and I did not get it done. Oh well. Oh, and you know what? I just realized, kind of made a mistake. I meant to go down more on this. I followed the wrong line. So you guys will see how I fix that. Yeah, that wing should have come down here and not up there. So we'll have to make an adjustment there and there. And I'll probably need to use a little bit more acrylic wash. But I may not have time to do that on the live stream because I'll have to use a different setup. Okay, who is the girl? A family friend. A friend of mine who has a little 7-year-old girl. So tips on watercolor. I don't know. I mean, this is the basic palette I use. You know, the setup on this one, I keep 2 separate sections. This is watercolor up here, and then this is gouache and a few extra watercolor pigments. I've started doing a little bit more gouache underpainting from this palette instead of using my whole sponge palette, just because this is a lot faster. I don't have to like get anything prepared. This is just always ready to go. You spritz a little bit. The main difference between this gouache and the gouache I typically use, this is M Graham, which has a little bit of honey mixed in, and so it keeps really well even when it dries out completely. All you have to do is spritz it just a little bit, and you know, it might need a little bit of brushing, some massaging, but it goes back to its original form pretty quickly. Whereas the gouache I usually use is Holbein, and if you put that on the palette, it ends up cracking, you know, not too long. But I use both kind of for different things. The thing about the M Graham is it's not perfectly matte, so I don't use it a lot for final work, except for, I'd say, Payne's Gray, which I use a whole lot of. For some reason, Holbein doesn't make a Payne's Gray, and I use that color a lot. That's kind of like my cool dark, and then I think it's Sepia. Sepia is my warm dark, and I have those both here with black in between, usually ivory black. I don't use jet black anymore, both because it is toxic, and also because I don't know why it's toxic. I just know it has a little warning label, so I've tried to purge my palette of anything like that. And then also, it doesn't mix very well, and so ivory black is just a lot more fun to use. Which brand is the red brush? Almost all the brushes I have are silver brush, which it's kind of like the best for the price. Like, there are better brushes out there, but not at the rate that I go through brushes. So I mean, and not to say that these don't last. I've had these for a very long time, but you know, I used to buy the Winsor & Newton Series 7 number 6, and now they're like $90. I don't know, I haven't bought one in years. So I just don't buy those anymore because they lose their point too quickly. Whereas this is Black Velvet. That's their line again of a mixture of natural hair and synthetic fibers. It's just a nice blend. The synthetic tend to last longer, and the natural hair give you I guess it's the color capacity that you need. They just absorb water and pigment a lot better than the pure synthetic brushes. The synthetic brushes are always good for acrylic and opaque work, though. You know, the thing with watercolor is natural hair is usually the best, just because you've got to soak up a lot of water and a lot of pigment at the same time. You don't use any, John asks, you don't use any airbrush? No, not really. My dad airbrushes all the time, but not for comics. I've contemplated it. I've done it in the past, like maybe once or twice. It just doesn't make any sense for me. And lately, anytime I do feel the need, I just cheat and I do it in Photoshop, because it's for my particular style, which is just, you know, purely subjective. I just don't use a lot of that, you know, really hazy look. So it's usually not what I'm going for. In the few times where I do need it, it's such a tiny little bit that it's just easier to do in Photoshop anyway. And it'll usually give me a better result than if I got out a real airbrush. And plus, I was forbidden to learn the airbrush by my mother. Alright, so now I'm just using a kneaded eraser to clear up all the pencil marks. Sometimes I leave them in, but this is just such a clean animation style, I want to get out most of the stray marks. Maybe I should go ahead and ink the one purple wing so that I don't inadvertently lose the line. So even when you've done a super tight drawing, there are always like little things you forget. So what I'll have to do, I probably won't do it on the live stream, but I'll have to cover up this line and that line, maybe with acrylic wash, which is going to take a little bit of mixing. That's actually the kind of the toughest thing about gouache. It's kind of figuring out the difference between the transparent look and the opaque look. And you can match them, but it's very, very difficult, and it's not necessarily intuitive. So you have to kind of know what white does to a mixture, and you have to know, it's not, I won't say it's necessarily color theory, it helps, but really it's just, you know, trial and error. You just got to figure out what colors do what, because it's not always what you might think. Oh yeah, autofocus. Sorry about that. Yeah. Strathmore or Crescent illustration boards. I usually use Strathmore. I used a lot of Crescent back in the day. It seemed fine, but Strathmore is just what I tend to get nowadays. All right, I think we're gonna go ahead and start here. And I might switch to a bigger brush. Just for the body. get the acrylic out of there so that I don't accidentally paint it. So I'll use a new piece of paper as my scrap. Whenever I'm going to do a large portion of a painting, in this case the body of the unicorn, I'll go ahead and water it all down first. So pretty much everything that I'm going to do, I will water first. And what that does, it'll just even out the tones once I get to painting. And sometimes I'll add a little bit of pigment so I can see, and other times I'll just kind of come down here at an angle so I can see the reflection. And I can tell where I painted and where I didn't. This is, by the way, 4-ply Strathmore Bristol board. So it's pretty thick and it can handle watercolor pretty well. It's not like taped down or anything. You will see some bending, but it won't be much. So, really not adding a whole lot here. Just kind of a warmish white. So some yellow ochre. I think I have some gray on here for some reason. It looks like it might actually be gouache. I can't tell. Excuse me. Test things out a little bit. So it's just kind of like off-white. It's not really. It's just to kind of separate it from the white of the paper, since this is just a vignette. And then while it's wet, I want to give it a little bit of a shadow color, which will be slightly cooler and slightly darker. In the cartoon, they don't really seem to use much of a shadow, but I wanted to give it a two-tone, just to make things, just to give it a source of light. And just a heads up, it's 10:40 right now, so I'm gonna, whether or not I'm completely finished with this, I will stop the live stream at about 11. So I'm going to try and do as much as I can before then, but no guarantees. Alright, so we have kind of like a base color down, and now I'm going to take a little bit of Payne's Gray, a little bit more water, and maybe some burnt sienna to warm it up just a tad. And you can't see it right now, but I had kind of planned out where all the shadows were going to be. So it's kind of coming from the top right. So there's going to be a little bit of cast shadow underneath the head. And most of the forms will be dark on the left. You know, even though it's a simple animation drawing, there's still a 3D form there. So I'm still trying to think around. So light's coming here. I'd say maybe a cast shadow right there on the leg. I don't really know. It's close enough. And then everything on the bottom. cast shadow from this little ankle wing. It looks somewhat believable. I'd say maybe cast shadow from this wing. You know, as long as you get it to where the contact point is, that's really what's going to sell it. I used to worry about cast shadows a whole lot, and now it's just like, you know, as long as you get it mostly right, as long as you get it not wrong, then it'll look right. Sometimes it is tough to make it look not wrong, but that's why I use a lot of reference now. You know, I have like little anatomical figures, and half the time that I'm using them, it's not really for anatomy, it's for like, I'm just trying things out and looking at things from a different angle, because I might know the pose that I want, but I don't necessarily know which angle I want to look at it from. And then if it's like two figures and I want to have a strong light source, the anatomical figures it's just much easier to set up a scene and figure out where the light's coming and the cast shadows, and you know, it's faster than even doing it in the computer in something like, you know, Poser or DAZ 3D or something like that. I've tried out DAZ for a couple things, and it's nice for getting kind of a quick mock-up and getting highlights and things like that, but I think that'll be enough. Oh, and I forgot to do the ears. They'll have a little bit more yellow, because they're not really in shadow. And I realize you guys may not even see, it may not even look like I'm doing very much, because this is so light. So apologies if it doesn't look like I'm making any progress whatsoever. All right. Once that's done, then we can get into things that'll be a little bit more colorful. I might go a little bit darker on the underside, that back leg. To make sure that it looks different from the body of the horse. Or unicorn, as the case may be. What do you use to fix a gouache painting when done? Well, gouache is easy because I can usually pick it up, you know, just get a Q-tip, wet it down, wet the painting, and just kind of lift it, you know, press it and pull it up. With this, it's a little tougher just because I painted an incorrect line in acrylic gouache, and I can't really, once the acrylic gouache is down, there's nothing I can do, so I have to cover it up. And anytime you do opaque work, it just takes a lot more color matching. You know, with watercolor, you can modulate the color and the value using water, and once it gets opaque, you have to use pigment, and pigment is a lot tougher to match. It's just not very forgiving, which is why I'm not going to do it on the live stream, because it won't look like I know what I'm doing. Alright, let's get my reference out here again. Start nailing down some of these bright colors. It's got some kind of red jewel on the head of the unicorn. Let me see here. Okay, and a blue jewel down below. So I use a little bit of I don't know if this is phthalo blue, but it's definitely that pigment. You know, it's kind of like a blue that tends towards green. You know, basically sky blue, as opposed to ultramarine or anything like that. You gotta watch out for phthalo because it's a pretty potent pigment. Alright, let's do the armor, which is kind of a golden armor. It's basically all like an ochre, but then each one will have a highlight. So and the more graphic it is, I think the better it'll read. So I'm still pretending like the light source is from up here, so I'll kind of put it on this side, but it may not be completely accurate in a 3D model. I am going to go darker on the gold, but I just messed up. The nice thing with watercolor is you can always just kind of pick away at it if you mess up. So I usually keep one brush nearby that I don't put any pigment on. It's just watercolor, or just water. And that way I can use that to either blend or to correct a mistake if I make one. Which, you know, it happens occasionally, so it's good to just have it on hand. Especially with something that's small. This is pretty tiny. And then the horn is kind of banded, but it's mostly yellow. It's like a pretty pale yellow, so I'll just do one quick swipe. And then maybe I'll go in and do a blue eye. I might hit the eye again with some acrylic gouache. We'll see. And then the hooves and the hair are all kind of like red and orange. Yeah, they're like verging on pastel, but not quite. So I think I'll use, I want to say this is a vermilion red. You know, it's a red that tends, it's pretty warm. It tends towards orange, which is great for anything that is red and in sunlight. And so a lot of times if I'm painting something that's in direct sunlight and I'm not going to go to a pure white, I'll actually use orange. And it ends up looking on the paper like it's, you know, a glowing red. But in reality it's orange pigment. So I'll kind of do a base coat and then I'll do shadows later. But in the meantime, the way they render the hair is each clump or collection of hair has a slightly different hue or value. It's pretty subtle. You may not even be able to see it on the video. The nice thing about watercolors, you can actually work either way. So right now I'm kind of doing like the body color, like, you know, the local color. It's where, you know, something is red, so you paint it red, that kind of thing. But the other way you can do it, well, and then once that's done, then you go back and you do the shadows. But you can paint the whole thing in shadow first, and then go back and do the local color afterward. And that's actually typically the way that I paint in gouache. I'll try to render most of it in monochromatic, you know, some color. It can be either sepia or black or Payne's gray, you know, basically, you know, whatever your darkest dark is going to be. And then once that's all set in stone, so to speak, then you go back and you do your local color. It's not quite as simple as just like, you know, painting everything that's red, but it's close enough that as long as you're paying attention to what you're doing, you can get away with only doing like 1 or 2 passes in color. That method takes a lot of planning, though. You have to know exactly what you're doing or what you intend to do. Oh, by the way, the brush that I'm using here, the Black Velvet 1/4 inch, it's actually a dagger, which is mostly used, I think, for like pinstriping. But what I did is I taped it with red electrical tape to make it a shorter bristle. So that, you know, the actual brush would start like right here, and you'd use it to do long flowing lines. But I really liked the point of it, and so I thought it would make a great watercolor brush. And so I just kind of modified it according to my own specifications. It's, you know, it's still not as good as a brand new Winsor & Newton number 6, you know, series 7, but it lasts so much longer that it's kind of almost worth it. Kind of like it better now. Especially if you ever use your Winsor & Newton for inking, you know, they tend to go pretty quickly if you don't take good care of them. I don't think they're technically even supposed to be used for anything but watercolor, but who cares? All right, let's throw some red on the hooves. John asks, how do I fix a painting when I'm done? I don't. I just kind of let it sit. As long as it doesn't get wet, it's fine. You know, I sent a painting out the other day. You know, I painted it 10 years ago, 2008, and still looks good. You know, as long as you keep it out of direct sunlight and keep it in an acid-free, you know, poly bag. You know, they pretty much last forever. Well, not forever, but hundreds of years, put it that way. You know, you don't see a lot of gouache stuff on display in museums, and it's not because they're, you know, got destroyed. It's just people don't usually, you know, it wasn't something that was used for finished work, and so it's usually not what gets displayed. But it's always my favorite stuff. I love seeing the sketches and the preparatory, that kind of thing. For those of you who don't know John Beatty is an inker who just happens to live in Daytona Beach, which is where I'm from, and where I just was for Christmas. He's always asking good questions. All right, let's paint these wings. All right, so this is the reference. You know, each feather section has a different color, and it ends up looking pretty cool. So I'll just kind of go paint by number here. The first portion seems to be a little bit more lemon yellow, so I'll grab. I just realized you guys can't see where I'm actually pulling from. These are my watercolors up here, so they were out of frame. I keep my lemon yellow over towards green because it's such a powerful pigment that I got to keep it isolated. Kind of the same way with phthalo. Like those two together make a very powerful green, and so that's great if that's what you want, and horrible if it's not. I'm just going to ignore this wing for now. Well, maybe not. I'll paint the sections that aren't messed up. And I think the tops of the wings are pink. I'm going to have to double check though. Let me look on the other side. Yep, tops of the wings are pink. And then the next section is more of a golden yellow, so I'm going to use some ochre and maybe just a touch of burnt sienna. And you know what? I might wet the section as well. I might have to do 2 passes on it to get the ochre a little bit darker. Yeah, actually I don't do it too much nowadays, but watercolor usually looks best when you do, at least in my opinion, when you do 2 passes of different colors. So, you know, instead of mixing alizarin crimson and ultramarine blue to get a purple, it shimmers a little bit more if you do 1 pass in alizarin and then the next pass in ultramarine. You know, because you kind of get that play against each other. All right, so I'm going to let that sit. I might do the other section. I guess that is, you know, I'm pretty used to watercolor at this point, but why it frustrates, at least I think why it frustrates a lot of people, is because, you know, it's difficult to control. The main thing to think about when you're trying to control it is that first pass is very important, and so it's almost better to just let it sit, let it dry, and then come back to it, unless you've gone too dark. So that's the thing about watercolors. You can kind of only go darker, because with each pass you're making it darker than the paper. Oh, and while I'm at it, I think I'm gonna color the bands of the horn while I've got this color loaded in my brush. All right, and let's do the pink section. Oh, it's 11 o'clock. Let's go ahead and finish the wing, and then we'll call it a day. All right, so the pink, I'm going to use alizarin crimson, And I've got a little bit of white gouache here, just a very tiny bit. And so you can make pink by just adding water, but if you use the either white gouache or white watercolor, you can really sell that pastel look. You know, I don't paint unicorns all the time, but if I did, my palette would include a lot more pastels. But they're pretty easy to achieve just by adding white. I do want it to be a little bit more intense than that. I don't want it to be too pastel. Part of the reason the wings are so great is because they're such saturated colors. So the tops of the wings are a very pastel-y pink, but on the bottoms, that's where the wings get, you know, it's actually pretty dark. You know, the red is a lot darker than the yellow. So I might do 2 passes. And I might end up doing a shadow pass as well. I don't know, we'll see. We'll see once it's done, kind of what I want to do. I do want this back wing to be a lot darker though. So once I've gotten all the local color locked down, I will probably do a pass over the entire wing in some kind of shadow color to mute everything down and desaturate it. But we're not there yet. All right, now we need violet. I think this is actually gouache right here. I don't usually keep violet on my palette. I usually make it. But I've been painting a lot of Black Panther lately, and there's almost always some kind of purple on the cover, so I went ahead and bought it. And it's been serving me well. This will be kind of a base coat, and then I'll probably go back with a little bit of ultramarine blue. Because it's not just this section, it's also this feather section. It is also purple. And even though this is gouache, it's not a big deal because it's so thinly applied, and also because the line is also violet. And so even if it does cover it up, it doesn't really matter because they're the same color. I gotta kind of go back and even this out. That's the main challenge with watercolor. All right, and then after that section, it starts to tend, I guess the blue doesn't really start until there, so I'll do one more section of purple. I think there is technically a difference between violet and purple, but I use them pretty interchangeably. I think technically purple is a little bit redder. It's the color that is not in the rainbow. It's like magenta, basically, which only exists in our brains. It does not exist in reality. As far as a wavelength go, it's a combination of wavelengths between violet and red. It's where our brains loop the rainbow back together again in over itself, so it becomes a circle. Or a sphere of color, if you will. And now I'm into blues. These are all, you know, it's close to a sky blue. I'm going to just paint the whole section this sky blue, and then I'll go back in and differentiate them once this section is dried. Because the first one kind of is more purple, and then it goes all the way to pure blue towards the inside. guess that'll all be purple back there. I'll go ahead and paint this last section. And then answer any questions, and then we'll wrap up. Appreciate you guys watching. I wanted to do a live stream just because it'll force me to get this done. I should have gotten it done by Christmas, but for one, I wanted to make it better. I didn't want it to be just kind of like some quickie thing. I wanted to actually make a nice painting of a unicorn. All right. So like I said, I'll go back in and I'll probably add some ultramarine blue here. I will darken, intensify this pink, and I will probably hit this golden section again, and then I'll go in and add a little bit more shadow, probably to the hair. To this whole section will be muted. Tops of the wings will be pink, and I'll have to fix this with acrylic gouache or regular gouache, depending on how brave I'm feeling. And maybe some shadows on the hooves, but you get the idea. It's pretty much there. All right, any last questions? Thanks for watching, John. I appreciate it. Yeah, definitely on the watercolor. Just give it that first pass, and as long as there are no major mistakes, just let it sit and come back to it after about 5 minutes. Oh, nice. Andrew Robertson's family is in DeLand. Cool. I've never met him. Followed his work for years, but never actually met him. Wait. Azra, your dad is from Daytona Beach too? You're not related to Ziggy, are you? I just asked because I only know one kid with the last name Casson. And by kid, I mean, 38-year-old man now, but at the time. Oh, thanks. Wow, watching from Paraguay. Nice. Thanks for watching. Will I be streaming more in the future? I hope to. There was a point where I was hoping to do it like every other Friday, but things always get in the way. It's tough to it's just tough. Usually the only things that I can stream are commissions, and I haven't been doing that many lately. I've got a ton I need to do, so usually when I do get around to getting one, I will stream it, and I will try to announce it on Instagram and Twitter and everything else. Because I like doing it on YouTube because it's both a live stream and it gets saved to my permanent YouTube record. So you can watch it again, or you can see it if you missed it. Leyendecker or Rockwell? I don't know. That's tough. I'd probably go with Leyendecker, but I say that without knocking Rockwell at all. I just like Leyendecker's, I guess it's design sense. But again, not that Rockwell didn't. Rockwell was looking at Leyendecker. I don't know. That's tough, man. Yeah, color too. No, he's just all around. He studied under Bouguereau, so you can't get much better than that. Plus, his brother was really good too, Francis Xavier, I think. All right, guys, I'm gonna sign off. Thank you so much for watching. I will post this once it's all completed, and hopefully it'll make a little girl happy. Uh, Thanks so much, and enjoy the rest of your Friday and weekend. Thanks, guys.